That was a terrible snap. There we go. That's a better snap. We're live. Hey everyone. Welcome back to the live stream. I have here with me Jonathan English, who will introduce himself in maybe like 2 minutes. We'll just let people come into the stream. Um, Today, as you can tell from the title, we're going to be talking about the history of the New York City subway, and we might diverge from that here and there to talk about other systems as they perhaps come up randomly. I'll try to take us off the rails from time to time to discuss random other transit systems. Yes, right? Because New York is so influential as a system, uh, at least historically. These days, I would recommend not following New York's lead.
Still influential, whether that's a good thing or not.
Yeah, I don't think it's a great thing these days, but we shall see how things go. Um, okay, quiet. Yeah, okay. Give me a sec. Let's see what we can do.
I'll try and sit closer.
Yeah, 'cause I have the gain set really high. Hopefully, if we just talk like this,
Is this any better?
I think it's better now. We'll see what people say. Um, so we okay. Someone's saying no audio. Once someone confirms whether the audio is decent. Oh, Jason is here. Jason is quite the plane expert.
Oh, nice. Well, I love aviation too, so very cool.
We can incorporate. We should mention. I don't know how much of the history of the air train you know, but we should mention the air train.
We can talk about the history of the airports too.
Okay, yeah, we should. Okay. Let's go. Where do you want to start with the well, you should introduce yourself since many people watching may not be familiar with you.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. I have been passionate about and interested in transportation for a very long time. I've written about transit and especially transit history in a number of different publications. So yeah, that's sort of me. I don't know what else to add, but
You are a doctor of transportation, one could say.
I am a doctor. You can call me that if you want. I will find the fastest route for the ambulance to get to the hospital.
Oh, very nice. I like the incorporation there. Okay, so history of the subway. Where does it
Well,
start?
I mean, so the thing about the New York City subway is that when you talk about it, it starts in 1904. But of course, it doesn't really start in 1904 because there are a lot of parts of the subway system that are around even today that existed decades before that. And
Such as
well, for example, the if you know the J, well, I'd be Canadian and say Z and sound a little weird. So the J and the Z, that line stretches of it along the along Broadway, for example, um, much older. There are a number of elevated lines as well that have existed at various points that were considered part of the subway system, but were subsequently demolished. So in fact, the subway is much smaller. The subway,
rapid transit
the
system.
rapid transit system is much smaller today than it was right after the Second World War, which was around the Second World War was basically the peak of the system. And in fact, the ridership peak was 1946. So even to this day, not as many people, before COVID or whatever, not as many people rode the subway as did in 1946.
Which is pretty unique among systems.
It's pretty unique.
Is the underground is clearly a lot higher than it was during World War II.
Yeah, I think don't quote me on it, but I think that it is, and certainly Paris Metro is as well
because
the old systems
both grown
because they've both expanded a lot. Yeah, and that's kind of I wrote an article called "Why Did New York City Stop Building Subways?" and it's really quite stunning. So
where was the article if people want to go find it?
Well, so I wrote a journal article in the Journal of Urban History if you're on the academically inclined, and I wrote an article that's a little bit nicer to look at called the same thing, Derailed. in Bloomberg, or it used to be City Lab, but now it's Bloomberg. Um, so yeah, you can check those out. But one of the things that's really worth thinking about, and why I think New York is such an interesting and instructive example for other cities around the world, is that we think about a lot of cities that are building crazy amounts of subways today, especially in Asia, New Delhi, various Chinese cities,
Istanbul.
Istanbul,
Go check out the video.
I guess, partly in Asia, I guess. But yeah, a number of cities are building huge amounts of subway very quickly. And I think there's the impression that that will go on forever. And I think if you were a New Yorker in the 1930s, let's say, that's probably what you would have thought too, because the entire system, the famous 722 miles of Clifton Hood's book, was was built mostly in a 40-year period from when the first subway opened in 1904 to basically the Second World War, and then it just stopped, and nobody saw that coming. Um, the thing that I find the most amazing is if you look at the New York Times from 1940, when the Sixth Avenue subway, the current B, D, F, and M trains, opened, it didn't even it barely made the front page. Like, it wasn't huge news. It was sort of like a one-day story.
If it happened today, it would be global
Well, I mean,
news.
the Second Avenue subway is 3 stops, and like how long was that a front page news story? Like, not just in New York. So I think that was the way that New Yorkers thought about the subway. Um, or I see somebody said, was it the first subway in North America? Boston generally claims that title, although
With the green line.
yeah, although it's complicated, right? Like, because like I said, the elevateds, which form part of the subway system, and in larger cases formed parts of the subway system, um, were older than that. So it's one of those things that if you're from a city, you can fight about, like sports or whatever. Um, and so, there, I think it's a really important question to answer. Why did New York just sort of overnight suddenly stop building subways? And I think there are a number of reasons why that happened. But if I were to sort of, encapsulate it in a few different things, one was that, if you go back into the history of the subway, it was built as what we would probably call today a public-private partnership. So two private companies controlled the system, the IRT, which built the original subway, and the BMT, the BRT beforehand, but BMT, Brooklyn Manhattan Transit, which controlled the rest of the system, especially in Brooklyn.
With the IRT being the smaller trains,
Yeah,
and
the numbered lines. So like the 1, 2, 3, the 4, 5,
and
yeah.
the 7.
Yes. So those lines were IRT, and the lettered lines are a little bit more complicated because some of them, the ones near the end of the alphabet, are BMT, and then the ones near the beginning of the alphabet are the IND trains, which I think is important to remember. So that's A through G. So New York has a long history of producing colorful politicians. The recent president, maybe a more extreme example of that, in terms of strong, distinct personality. But New York's had a bunch of very unique mayors. One who had to go into exile to avoid criminal charges. There have been a lot of crazy New York mayors, and one of the interesting ones is a guy named John Hylan. He was a Tammany Hall mayor. Tammany Hall was the machine that controlled New York City politics for a very long time, and he was a guy who really did not like the that did not like the private transit companies. And he was not unique in this. People hated private transit companies like people hate their cell phone company today. Like they're a really annoying uh, uh, utility
Oligopoly.
provider
Yeah.
oligopoly that nobody really likes. And so he would run against them, as did many mayors. But he took it to the next level. Some people say it's because he used to work for the BRT, driving an elevated train, um, and he was studying. He was reading like a textbook to study for the bar exam, so that he could become a lawyer. And he almost ran over his boss. So they say he had a bit of a grudge because of that. I would say that the boss should probably have a grudge against him more so, but. Um, Anyway, he decided that what New York needed was a third subway company owned by the city, which built lines to compete with the existing subway. And one of the benefits of that is that these trains, the IND trains, the independent subway system trains, or lines, are really well built. They're really modern by 1930 standards.
Relatively speaking.
By 1930 standards, they have higher capacity, more exits, um, full-length mezzanines, which are probably completely unnecessary at most stations. Um, they're really impressive infrastructure, flying junctions. Um, but many of them were built to serve areas that were already well served by transit. So they either very closely paralleled existing lines, or they replaced existing elevated lines. So they'd tear down the elevated and replace it with a subway. And so the city spent an enormous amount of money building this system that didn't, other than in Queens and parts of the Bronx, didn't really add a huge amount of coverage.
I think we should address this.
Yeah, I
This
can
is
talk about
interesting.
Moses in a second. Yeah, that didn't add a huge amount of coverage to the network. And then after that, and a whole bunch of other policies like the 5 cent fare, which I could say briefly, the 5 cent fare, the city, when they created this public-private partnership in 1913, basically got to control the fare of transit. Now, in 1913, that was not a huge deal because inflation was extremely low. But when World War I breaks out, 1 year later, inflation explodes. But the city says, no, you can't raise the fare. And they did not let them raise the fare for decades. So effectively, the fare was dropping every year with inflation because why not stick it to these companies that everyone hates? And so they eventually, with the depression and the pressure of the 5 cent fare and a lot of other things, they went bankrupt. And the city bought them out. And the city spent as much money on buying them out as they spent on building the entire IND. So this whole process of fighting with the private companies, whether it was a mistake to create the system in that way in the first place is a completely different question. But this whole process of fighting with them was incredibly expensive and incredibly distracting because by not expanding outward, which is what the transit system outward, which is what had made the system so successful in the early decades and in the 19th century with the elevateds, they lost the support of the real estate interests and others um, who
Benefited a
were the
lot
biggest
by
beneficiaries
building
and biggest supporters of it.
development
Yeah.
around the lines.
So okay, I see. There's a question about Robert Moses. Robert
Famous
Moses.
Robert Moses.
Oh, there's also a question about. Yeah. So there's a question about Robert Moses. So Robert Moses is such an interesting figure, and he was incredibly important in New York for a lengthy period. Sometimes I think his importance is a bit exaggerated because not that many people had Robert Caro write a gigantic biography of them. It does tend to make one seem like the center of the universe. Yeah.
Yes.
Um, but Moses was an incredibly important figure because, and this is the thing that's important to remember, he was very popular. He was popular because he was not a politician. He was seen as a technocrat that would do the the responsible scientific thing and plan transportation and other infrastructure. People think that he was mainly about transportation, but parks were, if anything, bigger. He was the head of the parks authority for both the city and various state park authorities. So he built huge amounts of parks, which unsurprisingly were very popular. And Jane Jacobs didn't like them because, um, she and Robert Moses obviously
Did not
did
get
not
along.
see eye to eye. But he was very popular because he was seen as not a politician, not political, and that's why the power broker, when it came out, was so shocking to a lot of people, because he was seen as sort of the incorruptible one in a sea of corruptible, very corruptible politicians. And he, um, the idea that he had actually been bending roots to, spare a wealthy guy on Long Island from having his property plowed under for a parkway. Those kinds of things shocked people and damaged his reputation very badly, among other things that damaged his reputation, which I think most people know pretty well. But on the transit side, it's interesting. So Robert Moses was kind of in charge of everything. He was in charge of building public housing, and he built lots of it. He was in charge of building parks, and he built lots of them. He was in charge of building bridges, and he built quite a few bridges and tunnels, and he built quite a few of those too. And he was sort of in charge of building. He was in charge of building parkways and sort of in charge of building expressways, and he built a lot of them. One thing that Moses was never in charge of was transit. And so to some extent, Moses didn't build transit because Moses wasn't in charge of building transit. So in many ways, that was a big problem for New York, because Moses was a bit of a wizard at
Getting things built.
at getting things built, at getting federal money for things, at getting other types of money for things. And because he was never in charge of transit, um, he worked pretty hard to make sure that whatever money was available was diverted to the things that he was in charge of. And I think he did have a very common for that time skepticism about transit. I think he thought that there's some quotes about, how people are hysterical about the Long Island Railroad being in decay, and, why do we care so much about transit, basically. That showed that he didn't necessarily believe in building it. But the reality is New York built an expressway system just like every city in the United States built an expressway system. There was an enormous amount of free money from the federal government for expressways that there never was for transit until much later, when transit had already declined. And every system, whether there was a Robert Moses or not, New York would have built a lot of highways with free federal money. And
he does have this sort of reputation with the buses, though. Is there anything you can?
Well, so the bus story is a little bit of a myth that they built the bridges so that you couldn't go to Jones Beach by bus. Well, you can go to Jones Beach by bus. There's a bus that goes to Jones Beach. So some of these things are a little bit mythical, but certainly he reflected an attitude that was popular at the time, that he served the middle class. Car owners were the future, and he wanted to design a city that was built for car owners, because he thought that was the future. And of course, the policies that were in place at that time that kind of enforced segregation meant that officially in the South, obviously, but unofficially in the North, meant that those kinds of policies exacerbated the segregation that existed.
I think I'll take this one. Craig says, "Do you think Hitachi should make the NYC R262s?" I think that, yeah, Kawasaki obviously has had their huge catastrophe in Washington D.C. with the I think I don't want to say what 1000 series, but one series of trains, which going to be talked about in a video soon. But I think it would be good to open the net a little wider. I think like Hyundai Rotem, and Alstom and Siemens would all be good to get on board for an RFP. But of course, I think like what happens in a lot of systems, you kind of see this in New York, is that a manufacturer has like a bad order, and then they just stop being included, or they don't really bid for future orders, and I think that's bad. New York should be trying to get the best of the best trains, and I think that having less companies competing does not help you get the best rolling stock. So I think Hitachi should definitely bid, but I think it would be great to get Siemens and Alstom and the like in there as well. And Stadler, like, why not? I think Stadler has been making great equipment, and New York could probably afford the Stadler tax. So I think it would be smart. But yeah, thanks for the super chat, Craig. And given it's 7:20, I feel like we should.
Oh, Union Turnpike, yeah, did say that Moses prevented. He didn't include transit on his bridges, and it's true. I have a document that talks about adding transit to the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, which goes to Staten Island, and Moses had no interest in doing that. So he wasn't interested in transit. He was interested in what was high tech and glamorous at the time, which was the
The
car.
car, yeah.
And the airport to some extent.
So what?
He was
So
interested in
do
the
you
airports.
want to give a really fast, interesting airport stuff about New York?
Well, I don't know. No,
It's been.
New York's airport system is interesting because it was so kind of confused.
It's also disastrous at the moment, as far as I can
Well,
remember.
yeah, LaGuardia is a little better than it used
It's
to be.
nicer, yeah. Than the big
You know, when you're sitting,
Newark in particular.
when you're
right
sitting
now.
at LaGuardia during the delays, at least it's a nicer place to sit.
It was not nice before.
So the legend of the airports is that LaGuardia, the original airport was Newark, the main airport for the area, and LaGuardia was sort of outraged that New York City didn't have its own airport, so they built LaGuardia. Phil LaGuardia was a legendary New York mayor who was also a sort of a unique figure, but maybe in a more positive sense. And he became an important figure nationally during the Second World War, but he interestingly, he was a Republican, and like a lot of what we might today call progressive New York politicians of that era, he was a Republican. So the politics in New York at that time were a little funny by what we think about today. But he was very keen that New York City get its own airport, so they built LaGuardia. The problem with LaGuardia was that it really wasn't big enough for the jet age, so they built a new airport called Idlewild, which was later renamed for John F. Kennedy after he died, which was kind of in the middle of nowhere. And this was one of the great mistakes, that they never built a subway to it. And this was, Robert Moses was again blamed for this, not allowing additional subway lanes. Caro talks about this a lot on the Van Wyck to JFK. Eventually, they were added, but the thing about it was, again, it was built just that little bit too soon. So it wasn't really optimally designed for the jet age compared to an airport like Atlanta, for example. So they actually studied the idea of building an airport in what was called the Great Swamp in New Jersey, which was really far away. And they had these really elaborate plans for it to serve supersonic planes and stuff.
I mean, hey, airports really far away aren't an unprecedented thing.
No,
like look at Narita,
especially in a city the size of New York. But like Narita, I think there would have been a lot of pressure to, JFK would have been the more popular airport. Eventually, they decided, a company called People Express, which was sort of one of the first low-cost carriers, were like, hey, there's this airport in Newark that nobody's using. Why don't we use it? And then they really grew Newark into the third airport for the region, and then Continental bought them, and it became Continental's hub. And then United they merged with United and became United's hub.
So back to the subway. What came after the kind of? So we talked about the kind of the companies, the IND included. I think an interesting topic to potentially mention are plans that were not really realized.
Yeah.
Do you have?
Well, there's so many. New York is the city of plans that were never really realized,
including plans that are being made now, which hopefully some of which are not realized. Penn Station rebuild, as currently planned.
Well, yeah. So the first and maybe most famous plans that were not realized were when I talked about how the city stopped abruptly building transit in 1940. But basically, with the Second World War, there were a couple little things they finished afterwards. Was something called the IND second system. So this was a whole other system for the IND that would have added a bunch more lines. Second Avenue being the most famous, but a number of other lines. And in fact, when you go around the IND system today, you can see that since they had planned this all as a whole, you can see spots where they even built the box for stations. Utica Avenue is a good example. If you look up from the platform, you can see 4 trackways because they were intending to have a 4-track subway go down Utica Avenue. There's the briefly famous South 4th Street station near Broadway on the G, because the Broadway, like the J and Z trains, were going to be replaced by a gigantic 6-track subway.
Be
And
pretty cool.
yeah, and they built a station for it, or at least part of a station for it, where the interchange would have been. But then they didn't obviously ever build that line. The problem with the whole IND second system plan is that it was, I would argue, obsolete as soon as it was developed. The the reality was that New York, especially after the Second World War, the growth was not happening in the 5 boroughs, with the sort of partial exception of Queens and, well, Staten Island, but that's a different matter. The growth was happening outside, and the second system plan doubled down on replacing elevated lines, duplicating transit that even today does not lack for capacity. You look at the A and the C trains; they share a 4-track line, and they don't use they use far, like, by these lines share 2 tracks going under the Hudson, and then they fan out into 4 tracks in Brooklyn, and it's a huge, you could call it waste of excessive capacity. And the IND second system would have kind of expanded that. What I think would have made more sense was recognizing where the growth was and upgrading the Long Island Railroad, the New York Central commuter lines, New Haven commuter line, and the New Jersey commuter lines to become part of the rapid transit system. And because the Long Island Railroad for years until the 60s was in horrible shape. And then another era of unbuilt plans was the 1968 Program for Action. So in 1968, they had created, the state had taken over the transit system a while before, and then merged it with Robert Moses's Bridges and Tunnels, which were supposed to generate toll revenue, and the Long Island Railroad eventually. And the idea was to create kind of a regional transit plan, and they had a bunch of ideas. They didn't really build many of them, partly because the city went broke not long after and had bigger issues to deal with, partly because subway ridership was in free fall and the existing subway was in terrible shape. And this was a recurring problem. Every time people were like, let's expand the system, you would suddenly see, oh wait, we've not maintained it for several decades, so we actually have to spend all this money on maintaining the system. And I point to the 1951 bond issue as a turning point. They issued this bond to pay for things like the Second Avenue subway, but then they ended up spending all the money fixing up the existing subway. So that
I think this is an
that was a
interesting
repeated
topic
one.
of conversation.
Will Staten Island ever be connected to the subway?
There were lots of plans.
There were there were a lot of unbuilt plans. So there were various possibilities. Going over the Verrazano Bridge would have probably been the most realistic, or a tunnel under the Narrows was proposed at one time. The subway, the R train even has sort of a bellmouth, I think, to go under the Narrows. Connecting it through New Jersey, like I don't know if that counts as cheating, but the Hudson Bergen Light Rail is probably the most realistic prospect. Sending that over to Jersey,
I mean, to Staten Island.
That's to Staten Island from Jersey. I
feel like the path is underappreciated. Like, it has so much potential.
Well, there's another line that has a fraction of the ridership that it had around the Second World War, because the Holland Tunnel and the Lincoln Tunnel, before they were built, the path was, along with the 2 Pennsylvania tubes, was the only way to cross the Hudson other than a boat. So it was incredibly busy. Most of the railways stopped on the Jersey side of the Hudson, and you'd have to catch the Hudson and Manhattan at that time.
I mean, most of the railways still do stop in Jersey,
yeah.
Unfortunately.
My pet project for Staten Island, which is maybe a little bit, I don't know how realistic it is or not, but Jerry Nadler and some other people have long wanted to build a freight tunnel across the Hudson. And I think for various reasons that would be a very challenging project. The demand really isn't there yet. So my thought is to kind of merge that with a tunnel under the Narrows.
Marmaray style
Yeah, we'll merge it with a tunnel under the Narrows so that freight can use it
overnight.
to overnight, which I think in the short term would be more than sufficient. And if freight rail on the east side of the Hudson explodes that much that it justifies a new tunnel, we'll then build another tunnel. But
Well,
I don't think
it might be a bit difficult. Tunnels are expensive.
I don't think that will happen. I think a half dozen trains a day or a little more would probably be quite nice. But then you could use it with a line that could be built potentially, up to Manhattan. You could run the subway on it, although there's complications to that kind of track sharing. But
I definitely think New York lacks in its, like, the express trains are great and all, but it would be great to have more long distance, like higher quality long distance services. It's quite restrictive compared to a city like London, for example.
well, I think that the rigid separation of main line and subway
It's not helpful.
is one of the biggest problems for that. The Long Island Railroad actually did once upon a time run into we call the subway system, it was the elevated system, so that it could have direct access to downtown over the Brooklyn Bridge, but they didn't allow that to continue. And I think that has been a big part of the challenges New York has had for a long time.
Path World Trade Center has only 2 tunnels to New Jersey, though. The path at the World Trade Center is interesting because it's a loop,
Yes.
which is
Well, so
unusual.
the path of the World Trade Center has 2 tunnels, but then the path under Sixth Avenue also has its own 2 tunnels. So it's still got a fair bit of capacity. But yeah, it did used to move way more people than it did today.
And they're talking about, I don't know if they've done this yet, but they have been talking about longer trains and stuff. I believe that may be an ongoing project for the path.
Yes.
Is longer trains, and it just feels like there's huge potential to expand that system because relatively small train profile, stations don't need to be gigantic. There's obviously a lot of demand on the Jersey side, but it's unfortunate that that there isn't more more integration, across the Hudson. It's quite problematic. I think Craig's
Craig
comment
Smith is right.
is
Yeah.
corrct. Yeah. Though
Uh,
I think an RER style system, it's really interesting. I think that it's unlikely that if we were to see something, it would really be a true RER style system. I think there's a really valuable distinction to be made between an RER style system and the Elizabeth line and through running, which are not necessarily the same thing. With an RER style system, you'd be talking about a substantial new corridor that has this kind of a high capacity transit line in its own right, and that's not really what Penn Station through running would be. If you were to talk about an RER corridor, it would be something like going from Penn or Grand Central, continuing south through Manhattan, and then going all the way down to the financial district and diverging in a different direction. Because then you're actually building a new high speed corridor, like super high speed subway, like a super express or something, that's actually its own valuable corridor instead of just connecting up terminals that already exist, which are already connected, which is the most insane part about the fact that there isn't better through running right now.
Well, and that's I think there's a question: what's the biggest obstacle for New York City rapid transit?
Thank you for the super chat, by the way, Craig.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the big question, and it goes to those sort of two other reasons why New York stopped building. One was all the problems they had dealing with stopping the outwork, competing and buying out the private railways and how much that cost. The second was the ending of outward expansion. They stopped expanding outward. They stopped looking outward because the transit system was always very focused on the 5 boroughs, or really the 4 boroughs. And then the third reason is construction costs. I mean, construction cost exploded. Even, and this isn't a new problem per se. In constant dollars, the construction of the dual contracts lines doubled to when they built the IND. So the IND cost twice as much as the dual contracts lines, which at the time seemed like a big deal.
Do you think that the increase in cost isn't something that matters in a big way?
I mean, of course it matters. It's not that there's a set amount of money.
I just think that there's sometimes the sense that, that the US is this really powerful country with a lot of money, which is true. And so cost shouldn't be a real barrier to expansion.
Well, I mean, it's not that there's a fixed pot of money marked transit
Mm.
somewhere. Obviously, if you can make a case for a project, you can get that project funded. It's just a hell of a lot harder to make the case when the
It's
project is
more
$10
expensive.
billion dollars versus $2 billion. And I think that the other problem you have is that because costs are so high, the beneficiaries of projects seem relatively narrow. Um, Obviously, Second Avenue subway benefits people far beyond that bit of the sort of the east side, but by relieving the Lexington line.
But
But
you're putting a lot of the capital dollars for the entire
for the
city.
entire city in one 3-track line,
And I think it
or
not three,
three stop lines.
not
Sorry,
even 3 tracks.
yeah, 2-track line.
What do you think? Do you think so? What is your opinion on 3 tracks? Because New York has all these 3-track lines all over the place. A lot of quad track, but a lot of 3-track as
Yeah,
well.
I mean, obviously, it seems pretty obvious that 3-track was a mistake. 3/4 of the 3-track, the third tracks aren't even used.
Mhm.
Like the one train up to Washington Heights in the Bronx and Inwood, it's not even used.
I think that there's
the F train.
yeah.
Well, the F train, that wasn't even 3-track, but other times the problem with 3 tracks is that it doesn't add capacity because you're constrained by the 2-track segment that come, like on the 7 train, obviously, which is a very busy line and with a lot of stops. It's beneficial to have it for people who happen to be riding in the right direction.
But if you were to add one more track,
Well,
it would
imagine,
be way
right?
better.
You could have a proper express on the 7, and you know, how much really more would it have cost to build it as? And I mean, obviously, the 7 was always going to be constrained by the Steinway tubes, but so the capacity benefit wouldn't have been entirely there. But yeah.
Well, I think the thing is people often kind of retroactively justify these decisions. Like now we can use the 3rd track for maintenance or for overnight work and stuff. But that's not a reason to have a 3rd track because you can do all of those things as we know without having a 3rd track. And so
Mhm.
I don't think that's a unique argument to have the 3rd tracks. And I think that if anything, and this is a comment I'm making quite broadly, but I think that sometimes that operational flexibility that those 3rd tracks and all the quad track gives you in New York makes it so that your operations can be a little less refined. And I think that probably operationally leads to a kind of more loosey goosey approach to operating things, which leads to more problems. Oh, we can be a bit more careless here because we have these extra tracks, and then that kind of builds your operational culture into being a bit more careless overall versus if you have to always be very precise.
No, and that does make sense, and yes, it adds some flexibility, but as a daily 1 train user for many years, I didn't find it necessarily helped all that much.
Well, and I think that the proof is in the pudding there is that if you want to do express services and you have limited budget or limited space, the real answer is to do, overtake tracks,
Sure.
not like timed overtakes, not
Although
triple
that,
track.
with the kind of branching that New
It's
York
hard to
does,
pull off.
that's hard to pull off.
But you
yes,
can pull it off.
it's not impossible for sure. And people are talking about sort of future proposals, and the proposal, which has many names, to use the existing freight corridor, which runs from Bay Ridge all around Brooklyn, and then up through Queens to the Hellgate Bridge.
The IBX.
Yes, now it's the IBX. Before it was the Triborough.
Wasn't it the Triborough RX?
RX? Yeah.
Which always made me think of like a pharmacy.
Yeah, I think that it was the prescription for the 3 boroughs or whatever. Anyway, no, I think that's a proposal with a huge amount of potential. I think it's a proposal where, I love to point to the Ottawa O train, the original Ottawa O train. It was in many ways not dissimilar to this line. It was an existing freight route that was pretty lightly used by freight in the grand scheme of things. They built the entire line. It was 8 kilometers long, 5 stops with trains running all day every 15 minutes. They built the whole thing for $22 million. Now, obviously, this project would be a little bit bigger in scale than that, but I think that that's the kind of thing that New York should be thinking about. If this, the kind of project, if this is going to be a full scale subway line at $2 billion a mile or whatever, uh, I don't think it's ever going to be particularly viable because this isn't, there aren't, it's an incredibly long line that won't have Second Avenue kind of ridership.
Well, that's the thing that I think makes
it's
costs
useful for network connectivity.
That's the thing that I think makes costs kind of interesting is um, cause, um, because what is interesting in terms of a project is really dependent on how much it costs. If you can build stuff really inexpensively like they can in some places around the world, it means that even a very small project that might have kind of niche benefits is great because it's like, well, this isn't that much upfront cost. Whereas a project like the IBX, if it was a $1 billion project, which definitely there are places in the world that could build it for way less than $1 billion.
The tracks are already there.
They'll have to be ripped out and
Well,
regraded and everything. But
the corridor is already
yes,
there.
which is the most expensive thing to
Although
to
the O
degrade.
train never did regrade, which had its issues, and they're now rebuilding it. But they got the project built.
I think the it doesn't need to be an expensive project, but that's the thing. The value of something means that it has to have some cost. And so at $1 billion, it's a great project, especially in New York where projects are super expensive. If you do a London overground style thing, which I personally think is the real, come on, that's the real thing that they're trying to emulate is like the, kind of like the literal London overground circle around.
Well, and
London.
look, and that
And it has freight too.
That has freight too, and it also used existing lines, and that project worked really well. And look, for New York, there is obviously a lot of benefit if, again, it also if it's reasonably quick. Like it has to be reasonably quick because people using this route are probably going to be traveling relatively long distances, other than some people connecting from the subway to go to their house or whatever, Maspeth or something. But that it has a lot of potential for network connectivity, but
which is hampered a bit by frequencies too.
Well, it's hampered by frequency, so the frequency would have to be respectable. There aren't and I'm the first to say that local trip generators are not the most important thing in the world. If your line is embedded within a good network of buses, other subways, whatever, then it can be successful even if there aren't good local trip generators.
Well, and the thing
but there aren't a lot of big local trip generators.
It's important to
compared to other subway lines.
Remind people that I think that there's this idea out there in the world of transit these days, or the world of pop transit, if I can call it that. Like people who just like transit, think about it, and want to help support getting more of it built. That the way you should build transit is you should build like a line. You should put up some condos near it, and as long as you have some towers near every station, you're fine. The thing you have to realize is that you're just never going to get the ridership from housing or even office space alone. It's the connectivity that creates the value, because look at what a respectable bus line can move in a day, right? It's thousands and thousands of people. It's hard to get, in a couple developments, it's hard to get, 10, 15,000 people. That's a
big development.
Yeah, exactly. And so most places are not seeing that level of development. And so if your plan for feeding transit is based entirely on TOD, it's just not going to cut it. You need to have a strong network of feeders. And when it's a heavy rail corridor, that might be rail. And when it's a subway or a light rail line, if you must build a light rail line, then it's buses, right? Or it might be active transport like cycling and walking. But you need to have a way that people are actually going to get there.
Yeah.
And your catchment cannot literally just be the adjacent block where you can put some high rises up. It just won't deliver the rider.
Well, the IBX to make the IBX work, it really needs to be embedded within a good system. The buses need to be improved. As somebody who rode the bus fairly regularly between Brooklyn and Queens, they could certainly stand to be improved, and they need to be better integrated with rail, which is a weakness, and then the Long Island Railroad has to be better integrated. you have to fair integrate it to make the whole thing work well. Um, there are a lot of potential. Um,
And they were talking about doing it as like a BRT or something, which I
well,
think it's one of those things where I respect that there needs to be studying of different things, but sometimes it feels a little silly to talk about paving over a rail corridor to make it a busway in New York.
yeah, no, I think I would tend to agree.
I,
Uh,
I also want to point out that with the TOD thing, I don't think TOD is bad. TOD is great, and we should definitely have it.
yeah,
It's just that you're talking about how good do you want your system to be. TOD alone is better than no TOD, obviously, and it's way better than the silly parkades that like Washington Metro and BART and the like build at some of their suburban stations, which can literally fill one or two trains with the number of people who can park in them. But ultimately, you want feeder
yeah,
transit because otherwise, how is anyone outside of walking or cycling distance going to get to a
exactly.
station?
Once the lot is full, exactly, and you can't, a subway station can move 30,000 people a day, no problem. A 30,000 spot or 15,000 spot parking lot is like, Disney World. Um, I say, this is also brings up the cost point. Somebody said Nick said they felt like housing on transit is more of a way of funding the line than trip generation, and I think that's a valid point. The problem is when your lines are $4 billion a mile,
You can't build the
you
housing
can't.
that.
The housing is not that profitable that it can cover those kinds of costs. It's something that you might be able to make work in a low cost jurisdiction or with a low cost, an O train. Like if you built an O train for $22 million to a major development, the developer could just fund that out of the profits of the development. If it's a $2.2 billion or a $22 billion project, obviously that's not going to be the case.
I think it's important. It's an important point to bring up that I think people often get this impression because of Hong Kong, basically that
Yeah.
that this idea of like funding entire transit systems on development is really practical. I do not think that's the case. I think where development can play a role is look at like Hudson Yards, right, or look at Barking Riverside in London. It's where you can do a small addition
Yeah.
that's pretty cost effective, that will connect something up to
Relatively
transit.
on the case of the seven, but yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
relatively well,
yeah.
for New York.
The thing on BRT too is BRT works best when BRT does a pretty decent job, especially for mid-sized cities, of of taking buses and then giving people a one-seat ride along the BRT corridor to the major destinations. Like it can do that job pretty well. But the IBX is almost certainly going to be mostly used by people who are connecting to some other line, in some cases to two other lines. So then it doesn't. Yeah, BRT isn't really adding a huge
I
amount of
think
value.
this comment here is really good from
Yeah, it's true. That isn't a very American approach, studying modes instead of,
what is
or
the
North American approach, studying modes instead of things like stop location, stop spacing, those kinds of things. You often get these studies where it's these modes, and this mode has a happy face in this category, and this mode has a happy face in that category, and
oh, your
um
happy faces. It's true they do
uh
things like this,
and
or circles and
circles
certain
and
amounts are filled.
half filled circles, and the same thing is true. They'll compare corridors, including completely unrealistic corridors, but there won't necessarily be the same level of study about how do you optimize the corridor that you are actually going to build.
Which is very important. And
Yeah. Oh, well, um, the I was say the opinion on bi-articulated buses.
so I have I'm gonna say something. I was reminded by your bi-articulated bus comment, so thank you. I want to comment something, and then I'll let you take bi-articulated
Sure.
buses. Um, uh, so what I want to say is that I think BRT is one of those weird things that it's a good solution for a lot of problems, but it is a compromise solution most of the time, and it's rarely, I think, good as a form of mass transit in terms of like if you were trying to serve a really large urban area, like a lot of the places that big BRT systems are built, like Guangzhou or Bogota or Istanbul, the BRT can lead to a lot of problems because it's hard to upgrade. It's very expensive to operate. It's difficult, especially until we have electric buses. You have a lot of, loud vehicles. And the fact that you have so many vehicles, I think actually means that the need for grade separation is higher than it would need to be for like a train line. Like if you build a suburban train line for like an RER style train, like a double decker that's like 10 cars long, um, you might need to have like 15 buses or 20 buses to have the same amount of capacity, which means that if you have like a crossing with a road, you have to grade separate that. But if it's a train that's going every 15 minutes, you don't really need
unless your regulations make you do it.
yeah.
But yeah,
And
no.
I think we do excessively in some places in North America. We excessively grade separate.
Yes, no, that's definitely true. And I think that when you're thinking about modes, you have to think about a few different things. We often think about capacity. Like, does this mode have sufficient capacity to meet this level of demand, which of course is always fixed between all the modes, which is obviously ridiculous. But yeah, um, yeah. The but I think you also have to think about things like speed, right? Like, get the area that you're trying to serve. Is the speed of this mode going to be able to provide a reasonable trip time?
I think we undervalue speed a
Well,
lot.
I mean, sure, like especially when you're talking about a network, right? Because when you're talking about people having to make multiple transfers to get from point A to point B, which is going to be inevitable in a system that serves a complex area, you're to have a reasonable average speed over the entire journey, your speed when you're actually on the vehicle is going to have to be relatively fast. That's especially true, if you're taking the bus to the station and then maybe a bus from the station at the other end. That trunk segment in the middle has got to be really fast, because otherwise
the average is going to be dragged.
It's going to take you forever, because those buses are always going to be slow.
So by articulated.
Was there ever any weird transit in New York? I think one of the, everybody loves to talk about this one, but there was that beach pneumatic tube, which was a novelty more than anything. But they did discover it when they were building a building, that somebody had tried to promote the idea of building pneumatic tube. Huh, I just realized that may have been popularized again more recently. But pneumatic tube transit. This was long before the subway was built, because of course you have to remember that, and this was an issue on the early London Underground. Before we developed electric traction, it was really hard to build a subway. That was why they built elevated trains, because if you had a steam locomotive, you're
had to put the steam and smoke somewhere.
Yeah, you're gonna have a little trouble breathing underground.
I do want to acknowledge the bi-articulated bus point. I think that it's one of those things where it is, again, it's not this panacea solution that I think sometimes people think it is, but I think it's a good option to enhance an existing bus system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if you look at some places that are really good at transit, like Switzerland, they do use bi-articulated buses, electric bi-articulated buses. So
I always sort of other bus types. My sort of controversial view is I have a little bit of obviously the Roosevelt Island tram is the weirdest, I guess, existing transit in New York.
It's not that weird. I would say
it's not that weird. No, like
the air train is probably weird.
Yeah, well, I'll say my thought about the air train is that it's impressive in a lot of ways. What I do not understand is why they run multi-segment trains when it's automated at reduced frequency off peak. Like, why not split those trains? Am I missing something
it's
here?
The brain rot. It's the brain rot from running a regular mass transit.
Why not split those trains and run them twice as often? I mean, I must be
interesting thing that I can say. I don't know that much about crazy things that never were done and things like that, but with the original air train plan, there was definitely serious consideration as to whether linear induction motor rails could be mounted in the middle of the Long Island Railroad tracks so that air trains could run all the way to Penn Station.
Well, or onto the subway through some of the subway tunnels downtown. Somebody said if New York City had a subway that carried half as many, that carried as many people as the Shepherd Line, would it still exist? Well, I can answer that question very conclusively, yes, because it has many. In fact, until relatively recently, I mean, dating myself, I guess, but the L train, the entire L train, which is like 18 miles long, I think, moved fewer people than the Shepherd line. So
Well, I think people get this is why with RMTransit, I always try to promote this kind of globalized view of transit. Like, be very aware of what other systems are like because it can really add some perspective. In the Toronto context, and this is not a video about Toronto, so I will keep it brief. There's this belief that the Shepherd subway, which is just a 5-stop stub, which is part of why it doesn't have that much ridership, is this huge failure because it only moves about 50,000 riders every day. But if you look at if you just go and look at ridership numbers for a lot of American transit systems, 50,000 riders a day alone would put it, it would be on the, it would be somewhere in the middle probably for rapid transit system ridership in the US, overall, like rail transit ridership.
So to give you an idea, the least busy station on the Shepherd line, which is one of the least busy stations in the subway system in Toronto, has around 2,000 riders a day, which is Bessarion. New York City has a number of stations with ridership in the hundreds. So
perspective is important.
A fifth or less. So that gives you an idea. Um, the
Yeah, it also has platform screen doors, which are otherwise impossible in New York.
Well, yeah, platform screen doors is yeah, the AirTrain's an impressive system on a lot of in a lot of ways, but it is bizarre that they don't. It doesn't seem to be operated to its full potential. The double-decker buses are. Well, I was saying I have a soft spot.
Trialed them more recently too.
I have a soft spot for double-decker buses, not necessarily as much although they're popular in systems like London and Hong Kong, which are in some ways.
Toronto, honestly.
Well, no, but I mean, I think that they would make the most sense in the New York context, routes, that travel long distances, down Nostrand or Utica or
well, I think anywhere
Flatbush.
If you use a coach bus, which I know plenty of routes do, that's a place where a double decker probably makes sense because you have similar constraints.
Well, the advantage of a double decker, it's especially good, not to say Toronto, but it's especially good for bus routes that are long feeders to a subway, because you kind of have the benefit. The reality is a low floor bus has a lot of compromises. They lose a lot of standee space. They're a little awkward because of the wheel wells sticking up into the vehicle. The advantage of a double-decker bus, unlike an articulated bus, yeah, you kind of have, like, downstairs you can have all that stuff. You have lots of space for wheelchairs, lots of space for prams, strollers,
prams.
Well, sorry, the lots of space for all that kind of stuff, and for people making really short journeys. But then upstairs you have a complete no compromises 40 feet of seats, so people can just go up and get a seat.
So this is something I always find interesting. The $8 fare for the AirTrain is insane. I agree that it's very silly. I think that I don't find it as insane as, and I get that it's expensive, compared to a transit fare or whatever. I think the issue with the AirTrain is that it doesn't go downtown. It's like a people mover for the airport that costs money. I do think that's very silly, and I think that what's worse though than that $8 fare is just that there's not a direct service, right? New York is a world city. It's one of the, when you look at the rankings of world cities, which I love to do, it's always one of the top ones, and yet it has zero direct rail service to any of its major airports. And it's not because there couldn't be. There's, like, if you look at London, right? Heathrow, right near the West Coast Main Line, and the Great Western Main Line. They short stub tunnel connect up to the airport. You could do the exact same thing at literally all of the New York area airports. It just doesn't happen.
Well, I mean, at LaGuardia, it's more the extension. It's been talked about many times. The extension from Astoria is kind of an obvious one in a lot of ways, and people don't want to touch it because back 20 years ago now, people got upset because you'd have to extend it elevated down the middle of a street for half a mile or something in Astoria. And I think the reality is that the city has changed a lot in 20 years. Astoria has changed a lot in 20 years, and and also the way that you build elevateds has changed a lot over the last 100 years since New York was built, or more.
People tend to forget that.
Since New York was building theirs, they don't have to be as loud as this rattling metal thing.
They don't rattle at all.
No, exactly. You don't even have to go far. You can just go to Philly to see that. And
Or literally the air train.
Well, or the air train, sure. Although you won't hear it over the Van Wyck, which is kind of the point. But the problem, the problem with LaGuardia there is it's pretty obvious. The other challenge that the New York airports have is, and this is sort of a challenge that they face with the way that they're designed, is that they have a pile of terminals, and the terminals are not terribly well connected with one another. And Newark is kind of exacerbating that, even with the new terminal that they're building. JFK is a zillion terminals sort of strung out. So it's much harder to serve it with a direct rail line.
I agree, but at the end of the day, yes, any sufficiently large airport is going to... I think it's better, though, to have the short haul people mover transfer as close to the airport as possible.
No, for sure.
I think what sucks about the air train is you get on the air train, you're riding, and just as you start to maybe relax a bit or go on your phone, you're at Jamaica or at Howard Beach and you have to switch to the subway. Yeah. It's better if you're at the airport, you have to ride, like at Heathrow, for example, you might have to do a short little hop, but then once you get on the train, you're good all the way to central London.
Well, and I mean, this is sort of the Piccadilly line problem too, is that, okay, the E train from Jamaica is relatively quick, but I used to take the A train from Howard Beach, and not only does it not run very often, because the A train is, the A train itself is not especially frequent, and then it splits with half the trains going to Lefferts. So I think that the travel time is really long from, say, downtown or whatever to or even parts of Brooklyn to the airport. So that does make it pretty challenging. Extending the JFK air train to LGA.
Well, I think it's a pretty good idea. Like, especially this is the kind of project where if it was cheap, yeah, why not? It's like such an obvious thing to do. Right?
Make Delta pay for it, because really it would be a bonanza for Delta. So United has some disadvantages, but United has a huge advantage that they have a single hub in the New York City area. So they can easily have all their international flights come into Newark, and then all their domestic flights come from Newark. So they, somebody flying from, I don't know, whatever, Pittsburgh to Dusseldorf or whatever can change in
Dusseldorf.
I don't know. Can change in Newark.
Truly, the average city one might travel to in Europe.
The average city. Whereas the
well, I think Jason likes your idea.
Whereas where's that?
right here.
Yeah. Whereas Delta, the problem Delta has is that all of their sort of more local, like domestic flights, not all domestic flights, obviously, but not to the West Coast, but their eastern domestic flights go to LaGuardia, and their international flights leave from JFK. So in theory, they can sell connecting flights, but in practice, who really wants to include in their connection a taxi ride down the Grand Central Parkway and the Van Wyck?
Union Turnpike has a very hot take here, which is that I don't know if closing LaGuardia right after the big upgrade just happened was...
Well, yeah. Yeah.
This is...
Well, see, people do travel to Dusseldorf. It happens.
As someone from Cologne, I disagree.
That people travel to Dusseldorf? Yeah.
I should say we do need to wrap this up, folks, because I'm trying to keep the live stream shorter now, not into these 2.5 to 3 hour long epics. They are epic, but so we do need to close out. But what I wanted to say, someone was mentioning LA and their automated people movers. So the video today where I was talking about Toronto was going to have a bit of a rant about Los Angeles in it. I might still make this video, but I think that this will be interesting to mention. Is I remember reading this article before, and I know this is a New York episode. LA and New York are the same city to me. No, they're
Oh
not.
my God.
Okay, I know. I just offended everyone an extreme amount. But I remember reading this article maybe in like 2015 or 13, and it was talking about how. Wait, what?
No, it's just funny. They're talking.
Well, and also Alfie needs breakfast, and
It's fair.
ultimately we're on Alfie's schedule here. But I found this article hilarious because not hilarious. It was just interesting. It was kind of inspiring. It was talking about the projects that all the projects that LA was going to build. They're building a new subway to the sea. They're building all these new light rail lines. They have the new bike share, and honestly, like yeah, like it's pretty exciting that LA is building all this stuff. But LA is this case where it's just such a disastrous example of poor planning because the APMs are, in my opinion, the perfect example of that. Automated people movers, at least in the LA case and in many cases, are a sign that you did something wrong because you shouldn't need to move people from an airport to a train
To a train,
station,
yeah.
right? The train station should just be at the airport. But the one that really kills me is SoFi Stadium not being on a rail line. LA has a lot of land, and I get that it's difficult to get together enough land to build a stadium, but when you're building this many projects, and also for something as big as a stadium like that, just build a branch. Build a branch line. Like in the Istanbul video I was talking about, like off their M2 line, they just built because they built the yard for the M2 near the stadium, so they just turned that into a passenger branch. Something like that. The fact that LA is not going to have that, people going to the Olympics who are supposed to be impressed by the infrastructure are going to have to get off their light rail train if the Crenshaw line even opens in time because it has to have this silly grade separation. Well, it's not silly. It's clearly necessary. It's going to have this retrofitted grade separation in. And then they're going to have to get on an automated people mover, which will be completely overcrowded anytime
Yeah.
the stadium is actually
Yes,
being
exactly.
used.
Yeah.
Because that's why you need a big train station. Like, look at I think it's like the Olympic Stadium in Berlin that has like the 8 platform
Yeah.
station,
Huge.
or Sydney Olympic Park that has like those two Spanish solution platforms.
And Metz Willets Point's pretty big
Yeah,
too.
you need a really big station that's designed to only be used in relatively infrequently compared to other stations, not a people mover.
My sort of overly reductive assessment of LA Transit is it is kind of like they're doing a lot of impressive things in terms of scale, but the reality with LA is the buses don't come often enough, and that really limits the system. Um,
And they're considered good though by broad standards.
yeah, well, yeah, but not good enough. I
Well,
mean, really,
I know
honestly,
they're not
for a
good
city
enough.
for a city that size,
Well, and it's also
it's not a
part
small
of why
town, and it's dense too.
this is part of why I think that the whole situation disappoints me because LA should have a great system. LA is a great city. There's a lot of bad parts of LA, like bad elements to it, poor urban planning and the like, and sprawl, lots of highways, all of these things. But ultimately, LA still has incredible cultural institutions, a pretty beautiful landscape,
Oh,
right
for
near the
sure.
ocean,
Of
lots
course.
of mountains.
Of course.
And so it should be a great city. It should have a great transportation system. And that it doesn't is just disappointing as this world city.
Well, I
right?
think yeah, for sure. And I think the other two problems are one that I was a transit loving kid or whatever, and I went to LA as sort of a kid and pretty young, and the Gold Line had just opened, and I was super excited about this new modern LRT that had opened in Los Angeles, and I really wanted to ride it out to Pasadena, so I got on the train, dragged my family with me, and I was like, well, okay, this is nice, but wow, this is taking a long time. Even in traffic, you could drive in like a fraction of the time. And I know they sped it up a little bit after that, I think. But still, the travel time, like I said, trunk lines, especially in big cities, have to be fast. Because if you're going to take a bus on either end, which is essential in a city as decentralized as LA, you have to have a fast trunks. Otherwise, your travel time is going to be crazy. And the third problem is if they ever do increase the ridership on by improving bus service, which I think would work wonders for LA.
And it will have to happen eventually.
Well, yeah, the problem is these lines have no capacity. Like they're sized for a city the size of,
Calgary
Calgary or something, and LA
is literally
is
10 times bigger.
yes, literally 10 times bigger. So um
Well, and
yeah.
now this also they're talking about. I know that it's kind of it's a well acknowledged that it's very silly, but there's serious consideration of using a BYD monorail for the Sepulveda Pass line, which is just like maybe if this was 1960, that would be like ooh monorail, but now it's just very silly. And then there's the fact that the subway shares capacity between the two legs, and the frequencies are not impressive. It's like every 15 minutes, I think, or every 20 minutes, at least during COVID. And so LA has so much potential. And I remember, so my personal dream of LA is watching the movie Her with Joaquin Phoenix, where he lives in a near future form of LA that has high speed rail and all of this stuff. And it's just like, oh
Near
my,
future.
it was filmed in Shanghai, of course.
Okay.
But yeah, LA just needs to get with the program,
They
get building some better transit.
I mean, that's the thing. The Metrolink network as a trunk network would not be the worst. The problem is LA, like Chicago, and unlike New York east of the Hudson, actually has a really big, large amount of freight traffic that has to be accommodated. So I think that is there's an opportunity there to building in existing corridors and have pretty decent trip times, but you'd have to find ways to make it possible for the passenger service to run at rapid transit frequencies without reducing um, the ability of freight to get trucks off the
honestly,
off the highways.
If price wasn't as much of an issue as it is, I would just say for a city like LA, just do what Seoul's doing. Build a bunch of tunnels under the whole region. LA is sufficiently dense that if you could do it for like Korean prices, yeah, just build
Well, I mean,
like
if you could build for
region-wide.
Korean prices, you could build a lot.
I know, but that's what's
Build a
so.
lot.
Hey,
Yeah.
anyways, they could do something incredible. And the thing is, ultimately, working with legacy lines like we're doing in Toronto isn't as nice as being able to build a whole new line that goes where you want it to go and hits the key points.
Well,
right?
and I've been pretty keen on this idea for the past while that high speed, I shouldn't say truly high speed, but higher speed regional rail is probably
Example
the mode.
projects like the
Well, Seoul is I think close to an example of that. Some of the Chinese cities are kind of sort of
Guangzhou and Chengdu
experimenting
and
with
stuff.
it.
Yeah.
Although maybe not entirely. But this is about lines that have very high capacity, rapid transit style seating, rapid transit style frequency, rapid transit style pricing, um, and also rapid transit style multiple stops in the city center at major transfer points. But then, higher speed in outlying areas, because that's the only way when you're talking about cities the size of Shanghai or Seoul
or LA.
or LA that you're going to be able to provide competitive transit trip times. And
Well, because look at the average speed if you're driving in LA, right? There's a lot of traffic.
it's not that high when there's traffic. Yeah, but yes.
But if at the end of the day, if I go during an off-peak period, you could probably have an average travel speed in LA of like 80 or 90 kilometers per hour, so like 50 miles per hour or something like that. It's going to be really hard to get to that on transit unless you have that higher speed to balance things out. Final thing.
Well, I was gonna say, somebody said, is a congestion charge the answer? And I think that the reality is, well, and can I answer this one too?
Wait, which one?
The GM conspiracy theory.
Oh,
Yeah, well, I think the person in the comments has covered the GM pretty well, but I think that, yeah, the reality is that you can do a congestion charge all you want, but if the transit
this is of course relevant to New York.
Well, yeah,
where they are going to hopefully do a congestion
well,
charge.
if the transit isn't there for people to switch to, it's just a regressive tax. Like that's that's the reality. People are not going to switch to transit that doesn't exist.
or
or
that
that's
isn't better
or
for
that's
them,
over capacity, or that would result in, going
making their
from
life worse.
20-minute travel time to 2-hour travel time, which is the case in, for example, in Los Angeles for a lot of transit trips. So until transit, so yes, use a congestion charge to provide supplementary transit if you already have a really good transit network and you want to make it even better. But if you're a city, and unfortunately this is the case in basically all American cities, where transit is only viable for certain types of trips, um, you got to beef up your transit system first, and then add the congestion charge later.
New York being probably an exception.
New York being an exception to that. Yeah.
So, last thing, GM conspiracy. Anything to say?
Well, the GM conspiracy is sort of an interesting. This is the the conspiracy that GM and some of these other companies uh, bought up the streetcar lines to close them, and
People look back on the streetcars with these rose tinted glasses that they were very popular and a compelling service. And sure, there were definitely positive elements to them, as with anything, but they were often in really bad shape and
they were.
slow and they were disruptive to the street in general because there were often a lot of them running down streets.
They were deeply unpopular, and I mean, city governments wrote into this wasn't National City Lines, which was the GM and others consortium, but DC, for example, wrote into the contract when they renewed uh, what do you call it, the franchise the concession for their transit system, that that streetcars had to be removed and replaced with buses because they were seen as better at the time. And I think that,
And there are some legitimate benefits to
well, there
buses
are,
over
and I mean, I think that they were wrong to want that, and I think it would have been good to keep the streetcars, but at least certainly in some corridors. But the reality is that streetcars struggled very badly to compete with the car, because
and with the bus.
well, and with the bus, because the issue with it was that cities were growing at an incredible rate, and the time required and the cost required to extend tracks um, by 5 miles every year as the city was expanding outward was just too high. So you ended up in these situations where the streetcar would stop at the city limits or whatever, and then people would have to transfer to a bus anyway, which just meant for a really long travel time. And in other cases, even when the streetcar, like interurbans, went relatively far, the travel time struggled to compete. So the reality is that basically every grade separated rapid transit line that was built before the Second World War survived. They're all still here. The elevateds in New York being an exception, but for really different reasons. The city,
And they were mostly replaced.
the city mostly replaced, and the city didn't like them aesthetically. Not all replaced, obviously, but and the reason that they were able to compete is because that they offered very competitive travel times, relatively speaking. So that was the challenge that the interurbans faced, and was GM happy to switch them over to rubber tires and
GM Motors
and Detroit diesel buses? But EMD, sure, I'm sure they were, but whether GM had done that or not, it was gonna happen.
When I think it's worth acknowledging that I'm not suggesting we rip out the Toronto streetcars or anything like of the sort. But even in Toronto, there is still legitimately, even I would say among transit people, debate about what is better, streetcars or buses all the time. And part of the issue is that you just have not seen it as being easy to retrofit legacy streetcar routes into like a modern tramway, right? The kind of thing you see when you think of Paris or Lyon or any of these cities that have like really nice modern tramway networks. They're quite different from the way that original streetcars were designed typically. And I think that retrofitting from one to the other is more difficult than you'd probably expect. And buses have a lot of benefits. And I think what a city like Vancouver has shown is that when you get to the upper limit of what a bus can handle, you can probably start jumping up to like a lower capacity metro system.
Well, that's true, and for new line, I want to reiterate, I do think it was a mistake for, I mean, some of the streetcar tracks inevitably were going to be ripped out.
And
But
some of them should have been.
but I do think it was a mistake to rip out the streetcar tracks, and the systems that kept them have, generally speaking, done better than the ones that didn't.
But
Uh,
that's,
but
that's also
sure, yes, yes,
it's because, of course, if you're not ripping out transit, you probably have the right idea about transit.
yes, yes, no, absolutely, and the but yeah, like I think that they're a mode that serves a certain purpose well, short distance urban trips, but you know has limits and can't be the only transit mode. I just say the Third Avenue L. Yes, it was a real shame that that was closed down. There were a number of L closures, especially later, that were closed for a number of reasons. To some extent, low ridership. To another extent, uh, they were just in really bad shape and needed a lot of work to fix up, and the city just or the transit authority didn't just um, this is 70s, so the MTA didn't have the money to do it. They were retrenching, but yeah, there was a lot of rapid transit that was lost, and New York is pretty unique in that regard. There are not a lot of
Cities out there.
cities in the world that have closed large rapid transit lines, at least not without direct replacement. Boston did.
London, of course.
Boston semi-direct
but
replacement.
limited stuff.
Yeah.
So I think that's it for today. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the live stream and watching it. We'll probably do another live stream like this in maybe a month or two. Send your suggestions in via email or Twitter or whatever. I'm not on Twitter formally anymore, but you can send your suggestions for future topics. Thanks for coming. Thanks, Jonathan, for joining
My pleasure.
this live stream. And maybe next time we'll talk about something else. Yeah, okay. Let me go like this. 10 seconds. Just wait. Just go like this. Now I need to go here. I need to